Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hard-working Americans and their families?
You will! This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefits in your benefit plan. Now prepare to learn,
Plan,
save,
and protect with the FIA Group.
Hello and welcome to the latest installment in the FIA Group's podcast, Empowering Plans. I am attorney John Jablon, and with me today, attorney Nick Bonds. Say hi, Nick.
Hi, Nick.
Oh, come on. That's the old Ron Peck turned Brady Bizarro intro. It gets me every time. And I make fun of Brady for a lot of things, and that's definitely one of them.
That lived for a very long time. I remember doing training at FIA, and that was in every podcast that I listened to as part of my training.
Yeah, it's just classic dad humor, and Brady's not even a dad. But anyway, so today, Nick and I want to talk about a topic that is near and dear to many of your listeners' hearts, and that is pre-certification or pre-authorization or prior authorization, whatever you want to call it, whatever your plans call it. It's essentially the same, right? It's when a plan requires that prior to certain services, usually certain, once in a while we'll see all services, but usually just certain services, the claimant has to contact the plan and obtain authorization or certification or whatever you call it to have the procedure done. And generally what that looks like is just a quick review of medical necessity or the experimental nature. It is not a full review. I mean, how can it be? It is pre-service, right? You can't look at the literal circumstances surrounding the claim. I mean, there are lots that can happen on service day that might change whether or not a claim is covered or to what extent. But the prior authorization is designed to give the plan participant sort of a baseline understanding of whether or not the claim is going to be excluded for those specific reasons. Very, very specific. And that is part of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. Originally, pre-certification was a cost containment tool. It was designed to give the plan early notice of services that might not be covered, right? It was designed to give the plan participant notice of services that might not be covered. They're both very important. Of course, the plan's cost containment is what the plan has in mind, but realistically, it can also help the patient by saying, hey, patient, did you know this service actually isn't even necessary? So you might want to reconsider whether you have it or not. That in itself is a bit of an issue because it's effectively the plan taking an active role in dictating care, not in telling the patient what he or she must or must not do, but giving the patient sort of a recommendation just based on the plan's idea of whether or not it's covered. It doesn't take into account what the treating provider says. Obviously, the treating provider is going to certify that it's medically necessary. Otherwise, sort of what are we doing here? But at the end of the day, the plan's best interests lie in cost containment and making sure that the patient is not making poor choices based just on what some provider says. And as many of you listening to this know and have experienced, medical providers are often acting in their own best interests, as opposed to certainly not the plan's best interest, but also sometimes, for the interest of their own wallets, as opposed to necessarily what is, I don't want to say what's best for the patient, but what might be absolutely necessary for the patient in a given case. And I don't want to say that always happens, but it happens. It does happen sometimes, right? I mean, when the individuals who stand to make a lot of money from a certain service are the ones who decide whether or not that service should be necessary, there's an inherent conflict of interest. And that is one of the things that pre-certification is designed to alleviate. And
so John, I guess in like an ideal situation, prior authorization was originally at least meant to be a tool to sort of encourage participants to take more of like an active role in directing their own care, like what types of services they were looking for. Kind of, I guess it wouldn't be applying things like other plan criteria that early in the process. Like if a participant was looking for a service that might be considered cosmetic, it wouldn't get flagged at the prior authorization point, or would it? Is that how
it might? I mean, there's a medical necessity issue.
Okay.
but there are certainly lots of exclusions that would not get flagged at that level. I mean, stuff like non-clinical things, routine stuff like, the plan might not cover this entire category of care, but the medical reviewer might not know that. And the medical reviewer just looks at the claim and says, yeah, in a vacuum, this does meet the plan's medical necessity criteria. Now, one of the problems we have, and I think this is a good segue into that, one of the problems we have is that it's not usually the plan doing the pre-certification. It's usually a vendor. And often vendors go by their own criteria as opposed to the plan's criteria. And one of the major issues we see is that a vendor will look at something like one of the large insurers' medical policies, right? And they say, pursuant to whoever, Cigna's clinical policy bulletin, this wouldn't be considered medically necessary. One of the issues there is that the plan might not follow Cigna's medical bulletins. The plan probably has its own set of very specific medical criteria. And, with any luck, it'll match whatever the reviewer uses, but very often it doesn't. It uses different, sometimes more broad criteria. And we see a lot of cases where the plan's language, under a strict reading of the plan's language, the claim would be considered medically necessary, but for some tiny nuance in whatever stricter medical policy is used. And sometimes the plan has to turn around and say, oh, well, this medical policy doesn't actually reflect our plan document. And under the language that we gave you, the promise that we as the plan made, this does actually meet our criteria for medical necessity or experimental. Or
so that can become an even bigger issue if you're not actually administering the prior authorization criteria in the way that they're actually communicated to participants and to providers in the plan document.
Yeah, I don't want to call it an ancillary issue because it's certainly related, but it is not an issue inherent to pre-certification. It's just something that does sometimes happen, right? It's one pitfall that you could fall in if your processes are not perfect. And what we usually see is that processes are not quite perfect. There are always gaps in processes, and they can usually be filled, but we do very, very often see that the processes are not exactly perfect with, alignment between the plan and vendors and intents and just, everything going on. There's a lot of moving parts, especially in the pre-cert world. And Nick, one of the issues, right, is that pre-certification does only review a small subset of reasons that a claim might be denied, like medical necessity or experimental. What happens if the patient gets a pre-certification that says, yes, you are pre-certified, and then later the plan does a retro review and finds out that, oh, actually, this is not covered for a totally different reason? I mean, what does that look like in practice? What do patients say? How does it work?
I mean, from a patient perspective, you could see how that might feel like you're kind of like the plan is sort of speaking out of both sides of its mouth. It's telling you initially like, hey, yeah, go get this service done. You're good to go, giving you like this big green light with maybe not adequately conveying what the prior authorization is actually saying, where really it's just saying that this meets the threshold to be potentially a covered claim under the plan. And then after the fact, the plan will review the claim as a post-service claim, apply all their normal review criteria, apply all the other language that's in the rest of the plan document, and might decide ultimately, oh, by the by, that's actually not a covered service for X, Y, and Z reasons. And from a participant perspective, obviously that's got to feel terrible. It feels like you're going to have whiplash from that series of decision-making processes, because it feels very much like the plan initially said, go ahead, go for it, this will be covered, and then says after the fact, oh, we changed our minds, this is actually not covered and it's actually excluded, sorry, have a nice day.
Yeah. Most, if not all, pre-certification letters nowadays say some variant of this exact quote: pre-certification is not a guarantee of coverage. And then providers and patients see that and they say, kind of like, why not? What are we?
Right. What's the point then? What are we doing here?
So obviously the point is, an initial review, but we do sometimes find ourselves wondering what the actual point is, because when a plan imposes a pre-certification requirement and uses it to do, a pre-claim initial review, and then, of course, does a retro review after, right? I mean, nobody's going to pre-certify a claim and then have the claim come in and then just automatically pay it because it was pre-certified. That is not a standard practice at all. And if you've got any groups or vendors that are doing that, you should address it. Call us. We can help. But anyway, when pre-certification is not a guarantee of coverage, and then coverage is ultimately denied, you can expect a huge degree of pushback, right? Because claimants are going to say, well, we relied on this pre-certification. We had no reason to think that it wouldn't be covered. And of course, the plan document is clear on it, but the plan document is not included as an attachment on that pre-certification letter. And, you could sit there and say, well, yeah, but patients have been given the plan document before. Well, yeah, but they haven't read it. And the providers haven't read it. And you can be sure that patients are not giving their SPD to providers. And you can be just as sure that providers are not asking patients for their SPDs. It always comes as a shock when a pre-certified claim is denied. That is just the fact of it. And in a recent, actually just from last year, an AMA survey, the American Medical Association, 93% of physicians report that prior authorization delays care. That's not surprising to hear, both because of who is reporting it and because of the fact that, frankly, I mean, it is, I don't want to say it's designed to delay care, but it's designed to put sort of a barrier between what might be unnecessary care and sort of the initial thought of that care. Because if a patient went to the doctor,
by its very nature, it's at least a speed bump. Like, it may be easy to get over, but it does slow you down inherently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of the plan's idea, right? I mean, when the plan imposes a pre-certification requirement, they're sort of saying, let's stop and think about this. Let's take a look at this before you go ahead with a service that might be unnecessary. Who knows? So 93% of doctors say prior authorization delays care. Usually not a huge deal because the delays are not very long, especially because of the relatively quick, timeframes, especially if it's urgent care, right? I mean, the timeframes are 72 hours. And then 82% say that it leads to treatment abandonment. That is a much more bold statement, I think. If somebody gets a pre-certification that is denied, 82% of doctors are saying that for a lot of patients, they would just turn around and say, okay, never mind. I'm not going back to the doctor because why would I bother? My insurance isn't going to cover it anyway. That sounds like a problem to me. This is a survey of individuals who have sort of an incentive to come out with a certain conclusion here. But at the same token, I don't have any basis to disagree with those numbers, and it does sound kind of jarring. 29% report that prior authorization has caused a serious adverse event, meaning, a pre-certification claim that was denied and the lack of treatment has led to something seriously adverse.
That feels like a much scarier claim to me. Just that fact could lead to other necessary claims that the health plan winds up having to cover.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just because the initial claim was not pre-certified or was denied or something, it doesn't mean that the resultant claims would be. Right. Because, for instance, if somebody has a serious adverse event because their initial claim was not pre-certified, and I'm not implying that the initial denial of pre-certification was wrong or anything like that. I mean, who knows? Right. I'm not. This is not a value judgment about it. But the fact is, if the patient doesn't receive treatment that the doctor has prescribed because the plan denies pre-cert for whatever reason, maybe it's a good reason, maybe it's a bad reason, it doesn't matter. The resultant claims might be emergent, and then the plan can't deny them. So we're dealing with a situation where a smaller claim that isn't pre-certified can turn into a much bigger claim that by law can't be pre-certified, because of course you cannot impose pre-certification requirements on emergency claims, based on the No Surprises Act. Doing so would be most likely catastrophic, because in a true emergency, you simply don't have time to pre-certify. You need that emergent treatment. That is the whole point.
Any speed bump in an emergency situation is not ideal.
Exactly. So small claims can turn into big claims. And, there's been some movement at the federal and state level. And Nick, at the state level, tell us about Texas.
Yeah, so Texas has passed what's being called their gold card law, where they're sort of trying to remove some of the restrictions that prior authorization requirements might put in place. And it's sort of one of a number of approaches we've seen states taking to try and streamline the prior authorization process. Now, obviously, for ERISA plans, these aren't really going to be too big of a concern because they would generally be preempted against an ERISA plan. But I think they are very instructive in some of the problems that policymakers have identified with the way prior authorization is being utilized and some of the impacts that it's having. And it does sort of demonstrate some of the steps that the federal level policymakers might echo and try to implement at a more broad level to try to rein in some of these requirements. So some of the key things from the Texas Gold Card law is that physicians that have a certain kind of the tent pole of the Gold Card law is that certain physicians and facilities providers that have a like greater than 90% approval rate or success rate with certain procedures, they literally would be given like a gold card where they effectively are exempted from prior authorization requirements for at least those services or in certain circumstances. And it would effectively kind of give them license to bypass those prior authorization requirements under certain circumstances. And that can be, the gold card is not irrevocable. If the stats on the providers drop below a certain point, they can be reimposed. The prior authorization requirements can snap back into place if necessary. But it does give those providers a way to avoid having to jump through the hoop of pre-certification, having to go over that speed bump like we talked about.
Yeah, and it's important to note two things. For one, this is a Texas law. This is not relevant to ERISA plans, right? Because even though the law essentially affects providers, it imposes requirements on health plans, of course, to basically give the providers these special rights. But for an ERISA plan, you don't need to worry about it because state law cannot bind you to abrogate your prior authorization requirements. The other thing that's important to note is that even when a state law plan is subject to this law, it doesn't mean that the claim has to be covered. This is only about prior authorization, pre-certification. You still do a retro review. You still look at the claim and determine whether or not it's covered under all plan terms. I mean, frankly, the effect should be no different. And I think that's why this Texas law ultimately passed, because the idea is that, so you don't have to do pre-cert for some claims. So what? You still look at the claims. If anything, this has the potential to prejudice plan members as opposed to the plan. The plan's outcome is the same whether or not you do pre-certification, right? I mean, you do a retro review, you decide if the claim is covered. The only thing that might be different is that if you're using prior authorization to steer patients or use some sort of special cost-saving programs, you might not get to do those if you are subject to this state law. But generally, the vast majority of plans, in our experience, use pre-certification as just a tool for sort of initial review and patient education, as opposed to a meaningful change in the plan's processes. Excuse me. So yeah, this Texas law, it doesn't make any claims payable that weren't ordinarily payable. It just means you can't review it before the claim in some circumstances. When these providers had these gold cards, you have to review it after the claim. So there are other federal law, or there are federal laws. That was a state law. There are federal changes that are going into effect here. CMS has recently passed a rule, and this it's streamlining prior authorizations. It's making it quicker. It's imposing greater requirements for specific denial reasons. Those were already a thing, but the specificity levels have changed just a bit. And they're also imposing new, what they're calling interoperability, or API, which is an automated programming interface. New standards. They want to make it easier for providers to submit prior authorizations, and they want to make it easier to give the results of prior authorizations. If everything's electronic, things can be streamlined. Systems touch each other, so they don't have to be, there's no need for human manual intervention at every stage, right? I mean, obviously, we're going to have humans looking at these pre-authorizations, but like when the result comes out, and then it's applied to a case, you don't need a human for that, as long as everything is just done sort of by the book. You could do that with an automated interface, and that is what CMS is trying to do. They're trying to just simplify and streamline everything, and by making everything automated, it reduces the time, because automation occurs like that, whereas humans are, I don't know how to snap slowly. They're like that. I can't make it doesn't make a sound, so maybe that's the analogy. But yeah,
because human snaps slowly doesn't make a sound. I feel.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good experiment. When my first grader comes home from school, I'm gonna challenge him to snap slowly. At the end of the day, one thing we need to look at, and this is we're gonna change pace here, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about mental health parity, which is everyone's favorite topic. I know. I'll keep it brief. You may know mental health parity as the rule that requires you to have no more stringent restrictions on mental health and substance use disorder benefits than you have for medical and surgical benefits within similar classifications. It gets complicated. If you have questions on the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, please let us know. But there's this fun thing called the NQTL comparative analysis, and NQTL is a non-quantitative treatment limitation. And federal law requires, as of 2022, requires that plans keep a what they call current, there's no specific timeline, but current comparative analysis that compares the limitations in their plan that are imposed on mental health and substance use disorder benefits to their medical and surgical counterparts. So if you are imposing prior authorization for a bunch of mental health services and you are not imposing those same requirements on medical services, that is most likely a mental health parity violation. It's a problem. Now, even if you are imposing the same requirements on medical, surgical, and mental health and substance use disorder, just because they're in parity, that's not a guarantee that it's actually compliant. Part of what the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act now requires is that your limitations have to be explainable. They have to be reasoned. They can't be arbitrary just because you apply them arbitrarily on the medical and surgical side. It doesn't make it compliant. If you can't explain and justify your reasoning, that is a compliance issue. So to tie this back to pre-certification, again, the question, why are you requiring pre-certification? Are you doing something with it? Is the plan changing something based on the results? What are you doing? Why could you not do this after the fact? Why can't you just do a retro review? If the answer is no reason, that could be a problem, because then you're imposing this red tape. You're making, this other hoop to jump through where claims might be denied, but for no actual reason. There's no benefit. But if there is some benefit, if there's a reason, and a lot of plans say that the reason is, well, it's designed to help the participant. Like we've been talking about, right? We don't want plan participants going in for services that are unnecessary, and we can help tell them about that because their providers are not going to volunteer that something is unnecessary. If that's the case, why is it required? Why can a plan deny a claim if the patient doesn't help him or herself? If the goal is just to help the patient and avoid unnecessary procedures, our recommendation is to try to make pre-certification optional whenever possible. If the goal is to help patients, then you give patients the option to help themselves. But if you require it and you impose a penalty if they don't, we urge you to think about what is the reason. Why is this penalty warranted? Just for missing a phone call or something that really doesn't impact the plan's benefits in any way. So just think about it. What CMS and the states are trying to do is use a common sense approach where they look at pre-cert and they're like, well, pre-cert is not that important because you could just do a retro review. That is usually the case. Not always the case, because like I said, some plans do stuff like steerage, or they use vendors to try to intervene before a high dollar or possibly unnecessary cost is incurred. But ultimately, you need a reason for everything you do, and pre-certification is no exception. If you're imposing pre-certification because you hope that people will miss it and you hope to be able to reduce claims costs, that is not ideal. It's not in line with ERISA, right? You're not supposed to be able to game the system like that. So if you're putting in a speed bump in order to slow down traffic and cause people to stop and think, great. But if you're putting in a speed bump on the highway, that's going to just cause problems left and right. I don't know if that analogy is good, but it might be. Think about it. It might be a problem.
Kind of in that vein, I have a question. In a situation where a plan wants to impose a pre-certification prior authorization requirement, but the penalty for failure to secure prior authorization isn't a full denial. If it's something like a reduction in the total benefit, like maybe the plan will pay like $500 less or $200 less, some smaller penalty, I guess the stakes would probably be a little less high, but that also seems like it would be less of a genuine speed block and more of like an encouragement. It's not necessarily voluntary, but it could help ensure that participants are actually utilizing the prior authorization criteria without ultimately jeopardizing whether a claim is covered or not. Does that make sense?
It does. It's interesting. Although I think on the flip side of that, the smaller your penalty, the more you're kind of tipping your hand that the pre-certification is not for maybe a great reason, you know? But yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, if full denials based on a failure to pre-certify, those happen quite often. And when we see that kind of language, we often flag it and we say, you might want to reevaluate this just because it's sort of a steep penalty, right? For something that might not warrant such a steep penalty. And you're definitely going to get a ton of pushback if you deny a claim entirely for failure to pre-cert. So yeah, Nick, any closing statements? I know we've gone on for a while about this. There's a lot to say, but there's
a lot to say. I know we have seen a lot of states taking steps beyond Texas. I know Colorado, Alaska, Michigan, even Washington, D.C., they've implemented various forms of prior authorization reform. Most of them take the form of time limits on the amount of time a plan has to make a prior authorization determination. Some of them will specifically impose requirements to publicize prior authorization criteria, either in the plan materials or even publicly on like a website by the insurer or the plan sponsor, whatever the case may be. If you are dealing with a non-ERISA plan that might be subject to any of that, please feel free to reach out and we can look into some of those requirements for you. Beyond that, like John was saying, it can be, I can see the appeal from a cost containment perspective to imposing a prior authorization requirement. We would, I think, just always caution to make sure that you fully understand what you're imposing and why you're imposing it, and making sure that it's, carefully communicated and administered, and any flaw or error in how that is handled or administered could lead to some domino effects for claims down the road. Because anytime you're introducing any sort of complexity into how benefits are received, you're also leaving yourself vulnerable to issues in administration, issues in stop loss reimbursements. Like if a carrier sees that you should have imposed prior authorization and you didn't, that could give the stop loss carrier ammo to deny reimbursement down the road. So there's, I think, a lot of implications that you need to take into consideration before relying too heavily on steep prior authorization criteria.
That is an excellent point, Nick, about stop loss. And it actually, there's one more point that I meant to make earlier, but I got sidetracked. Big surprise. I get sidetracked a lot. When your plan document says something like, for failure to obtain pre-certification when required, the plan may impose a penalty of whatever it may be. That word may is an absolute killer. The plan should never maybe impose a penalty, because then people have no idea whether or not they actually have to get pre-certification. Because, if it's a requirement, but the plan's not going to enforce the penalty, right? I mean, what's a requirement?
It's a discretionary requirement. How do you make sure you're imposing it on a consistent basis?
Yeah. I mean, plans will always need to worry about that, because if the plan document says may, even if you do it 100% of the time, there's still room for a participant to argue, well, you said may, so it's not guaranteed. You can't definitely punish me. What does may mean? Under what circumstances would you? Under what circumstances would you not? Just say what you mean. Like any other benefit. Like if you were going to write, we will cover primary care visits. We may cover them at 50%. Oh, you may? Just say what you're going to do. If you're going to impose a penalty, say that the plan will impose the penalty. If you're not going to impose it, say that the plan will not impose it. But using wishy-washy language like may, that you may impose a penalty, it just doesn't say anything. And it leaves the door open to argument anytime you do impose the penalty. Because if there's even one time that you didn't, that a claimant is going to latch onto that and say, you're treating me differently than that person. All right. Thank you, Nick. This is great. And if anybody has any questions on this or anything else, definitely, please feel free to reach out to FIA, whether it's through your your ICE email or our normal PGC referral email, we are happy to help. On behalf of myself, John Jablon, and this guy, Nick Bonds, thank you for tuning in, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.